Comenius, Plants. Praefatio pro oimion. Theophrastus on the flower. We've already learned that Theophrastus included the flower in a classification of plant parts he called ta epetea mere, the cyclical or annual parts. He also qualified these parts as ta prosten carpotokion, the plant parts that participate in the production of their fruit. Many of us find the flower the most striking and fascinating plant part, so let's look in more detail at what Theophrastus has to say about it. When we say we love flowers, our implicit definition of a flower is that which has colorful petals, that is, anything with a corolla. But the flower is much more than its corolla. Let's start by looking at a flower as defined in botany today, and then examine what Theophrastus's understanding was. First, not all plants have flowers, but the flower is the reproductive organ of those plants that do. A perfect plant is defined as one whose flower has both the female and the male parts for reproduction. In its shape, the flower of a perfect plant is a congeries of 4 whorls or concentric layers, only one of which is the corolla. The first 2 whorls are the sepals, collectively called the calyx, and the petals, collectively called the corolla. The calyx and corolla together constitute the perianth. The perianth presumably evolved to protect the reproductive parts during their development, and it is also an attractant for pollination. The 3rd and 4th whorls are the stamens or male organs, each consisting of a filament capped by a pollen-producing anther. The stamens collectively are called the andrecium, and the carpels or pistils, the female parts, collectively called the gynecium. A carpel or pistil consists of a pollen-receiving stigma, a style, and an ovary. The ovary houses the ovules that, after fertilization, ripen into seeds and fruit. Now, what did Theophrastus know of all this? First, as we'll see, the Greeks did not have names for all these parts. Second, while, as we'll also see, Theophrastus intuited that a flower as he understood it seemed to necessarily precede the plant's development of fruit or seed, the leaf, flower, and pedicel are ta mere ta prosten carpotokion, he understood nothing of the underlying reproductive process. In fact, neither did Comenius. Genuine knowledge of plant reproduction only started to emerge in the decades following Comenius, as we'll see later in our tour of botanical history. The Greeks did characterize some plants as male and some as female, but not in the sexually dimorphic sense of modern botany. Their gendering of plants was essentially metaphorical, just as they characterized certain stones as male or female. And if you are interested in gender studies, you might be interested in which characteristics of stones and plants the Greeks considered male or female. Now, Theophrastus had to concede with his contemporaries that the fig tree, so ubiquitous in the ancient Mediterranean lands, produced its fruit several times a year without a trace of flower. In fact, Linnaeus, well after Comenius, still classified the fig among his cryptogamia, his classification of plants that bear fruit apparently without flowers or seeds. Only in the modern era did botanists determine that the fig isn't in fact a fruit at all. It is what they call a false fruit that contains an inflorescence of flowers and seeds within it. However, Theophrastus did wrestle with the proper definition of a flower and its apparent role in producing fruit and seed, and he arrived at an expanded concept of flower that is more than merely a brilliant corolla. And this was the germinal idea, according to Edward Lee Green, out of which the whole of systematic botany has been engendered. For this alone, Green says, Theophrastus deserves Linnaeus's epithet, parens Botanices. Let's start by looking at how Theophrastus classified flowers. First, he isolated into a distinct category those flowers that have a particular surface that is knoodes. Knoodes comes from hoknoos, a particular meaning of which was the down on a flower. The Romans called this lanugo, from lana, wool, and lanugo and lanuginous mean the same in botany today. Knoodes may be translated as downy, but Theophrastus applied the term broadly, and I have also seen it translated as hair-like and as capillary, which in botanical terminology today means hair-like. Ton anthon ta menesti knoode, katsaper to tes ampelu. Of flowers, some are knoode, as for example that of the vine, florum alii lanuginei ut vitis, to tes sucaminu, that of the mulberry, Latin mori, and in Greek the mulberry tree is both he sucaminos and he morea, to tu kitu, that of ivy, Latin heterae. So Theophrastus does not limit flowers to those that have showy petals. He certainly has a category for the great majority of flowers with showy petals, but check out what he calls them. Ta de pulode, katsaper tes amygdales. Some flowers are leafy, as for example the flower of the almond tree, alai foliati ut amygdalae, tes meleas, that of the apple tree, Latin mali, tes apiu, that of the pear, Latin piri, tes cocumeleas, that of the plum, Latin pruni. The Greek word for plum, cocumelea, literally means the cuckoo apple tree. So why does Theophrastus call the flowers with the showy petals ta pulode, the leafy ones? Amazingly, neither the Greeks nor the Romans had a word for a flower petal. For them, a flower petal was simply a special kind of leaf, a flower leaf, if you will. According to William T. Stern in his book Botanical Latin, the late Latin word petalum, from which we get petal, was only first suggested in 1649 to distinguish floral leaves from ordinary leaves. This means, by the way, that Shakespeare did not have the word petal. Petalum is the Latinization of the Greek word to petalon, cognate with petanumi. Petanumi means to spread out, to flatten, and in classical Greek, petalon meant both a leaf on plants, usually as ta petala in the plural, and a leaf of metal. We also learn from Theophrastus in his book 3 about trees that grow in the wild that the Greeks were not unanimous in which trees they considered to be flowering. Ampis betetai de kai periton anthon enion, hoimengar kai drun anthein oiontai kai ten herakleotin karuan kai dios balanon eti de pelkin kai pitun. There is also a debate about the flowers of some trees. Some think that the oak bears flowers, and also the hazel, the chestnut, and even the fir and Aleppo pine. Quin et de floribus quarundam sententia varia est, quidam enim robur et nucem avellanum et castaneam florere existimant, item pinum et piceam. Hoide uden tuton. Some, however, think that none of these has a flower. Alai nullam earum. Alaton iulon ton entais caruais, kai to bruon to druinon, kai ton kyteron ton pituinon homoion kai analogon enai tois pro apoptotois erinois. But they think that the catkin in the nuts, the moss in the oak, the flowering tuft in the pine, resemble and correspond to the wild flowerless figs that drop off prematurely. Sed willum nucis vel iulum, et muscum roboris, et nucamentum piccae proportione grossis praeciduis respondere existimant. The catkin we know to be the male flower in the hazel. The hazel has a small female flower pictured for reference on the right. The oak moss we know is not a plant part and not even a plant at all, but a species in the kingdom fungi. Oak moss is a lichen symbiotic with fungus that grows on but is not part of the oak. What Hort translates as flowering tuft, ho kytaros is a rare word in Greek, we know to be the male pollen-producing pine cone. The female cone is shown for reference on the right. The male cone, by the way, is herbaceous, meaning non-woody, the female cone woody. Some Greeks, the simple-minded woodsmen, says Green a little quaintly, insisted that the hazel's catkin, the oak's moss, the pine tree's cone are not flowers, that they appear and behave like the flowerless wild figs that drop off prematurely. It is true, by the way, that the male catkin and the male pine cone do quickly drop from their trees once they have fulfilled their duty and pollinated their female counterparts. Others, and Theophrastus is in this camp according to Green, others believe these things are flowers. Returning to Book 1 of Theophrastus and his distinction between antheknoode and anthepulode, all his examples thus far were from trees, but he went on to say, without providing any examples, homoios de kai entois epitheois kai poiodesi tamen pulode ta de knoode. Similarly, in annual or garden flowers and in herbaceous or wild flowers, we find some leafy, some knoode. Poiodes or poodes is from poa or poia or poie, grass. Pari modo et in annuorum herbaceorumque genere alai foliati alai lanuginei. In de tois epitheois skedon tage plea toi auta kai dicroa kai di anthe. Among the annuals or garden flowers, most are of this character. Their flowers are two-colored and two-flowered. At in annuis ex maiore pene parte tales exeunt et bicolores et bini. Lego de dianthes hoti heteron anthos in toi anthe eke kata meson. Hosperto rodon, kaito krinon, kaito ion tomelan. I mean by two-flowered that the plant has another flower inside the flower, in the middle, as with the rose, lily, and violet. Bini enquam, quodam flore alterum florem incidentem medeum gerunt, ut rosa, lilium, viola nigra. With the flower inside the flower, Theophrastus is referring to the male stamens and female styles. Again, for these parts, which indeed are differently colored from the flower leaves, that is, the petals, as seen in the red rose, white lily, and purple violet, the Greeks had no names. However, Green says, this is the earliest recognition of the flower as other than a simple organ. It is the small but significant beginning of the classification of the parts of flowers. Note, however, that Theophrastus never mentions the calyx, that is, the sepals. Also, he understands the ovary and its ovules not as part of the flower, but as separate parts of the plant, the fruit or seeds, in an early stage of their maturity. Though Theophrastus' catalogue of flower parts and function is deficient, his observations about the differences between the flowers of different plants are remarkably precise. For example, diapere kai kataten ekpusin kai tesin, tamengar eke peri auton ton carpon. There are also differences in the way the flowers grow out and in the position they occupy. Some plants, on the one hand, have the flower around the fruit itself. Differunt etiam ortu et positu, alia namque florum circum fructum ipsum producunt. The complete exposition is too lengthy to quote here, but Theophrastus, who conceives of the ovary not as part of the flower but as the separate plant part, fruit, or pericarp in its early stage of development, is comparing the outgrowth and position of the flower petals in different plants with respect to their early stage fruit. Allowing for our more detailed catalog of floral parts, Theophrastus has distinguished what modern botany calls the hypogynous, perigynous, and epigynous insertion points in floral structure, the point where the male stamens, petals, and sepals converge and attach or insert themselves relative to the gynecium or ovary. Hypogynous, for example, is coined from Greek hupo and gyne, meaning literally under the woman, where the woman is the pistil, ovary, or gynecium. So hypogynous means the stamens, petals, and sepals converge and attach themselves under the pistil, ovary, or gynecium. As far as the ovary is concerned, she is in the superior position. When the stamens, petals, and sepals converge and insert themselves in the middle of the ovary, that is the perigynous, half inferior, or if you are the ovary, half superior position. At the opposite extreme is the epigynous, or from the woman's point of view, inferior position. Theophrastus made inroads in his conception and description of the flower that were way ahead of his time. Yet the Greeks, strikingly, did not even have words for fundamental parts of the flower like petal and pistil and stamen. To stay on the Theophrastus track, proceed to our presentations on taxonomy in Theophrastus. But when thinking about flowers in ancient Greece, it seems a shame not to at least briefly touch upon the role of flowers in Greek mythology. If you're interested, check out this presentation first.